you all know who I am, so I won't go into that. I will give you one announcement for our next Lunch and Learn, which will be next month, May 18th, Wednesday evening. Hannah, who is one of the geologists or the geology program manager at TELUS, will be here. And she's going to talk to us about some of the collecting trips they've been on out there as part of TELUS program staff and some of the natural materials that are found here in Bartow County. So that'll be a little interesting. So our program this evening, Amelia Golcheski is here with us. She is a doctoral candidate in history at Emory University. Her research examines the professionalization of women's care labor in central Appalachia at the end of the 20th century. She traces the development of unpaid labor in the home to jobs defined by care in the education, healthcare, and childcare professions. Her work argues that women's labor, vital and unpaid in the industrial economy in the early 20th century, became central to the region's post-industrial landscape. Before coming to Emory, Amelia received a master's in public humanities from Brown University and bachelor's in history from Agnes Scott. Please join me in welcoming Amelia Golcheski.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, for giving me a space to kind of talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is the history of care labor in Appalachia. I spend most of my days researching, writing, thinking about care labor in Appalachian history. And so tonight, I'd like to discuss care labor within the context of the Foxfire project. So I'll discuss and define care labor, give a little history on Appalachia and Foxfire in the mid-20th century, and then I'm going to argue that at a time of significant change, Foxfire used care labor to preserve a version of Appalachian history and culture. And by understanding the work of students and the people they interviewed or contacts as care, we can fully acknowledge the many labors that sought to preserve Southern Appalachia's rich history and traditions. So, first, let's talk about care labor. It's a term that you might have heard in the news over the last couple years. In this context, care labor is often used to describe the ways that caregivers, particularly women, have done the lion's share of housework and childcare while doing their own jobs during the COVID pandemic. So in this sense, care labor refers to the work of caring for others. And you might be wondering why something that comes so second nature to us, like caring for your neighbors, your friends, your family, why that's even noteworthy for scholarly study. And I argue that this is exactly the reason we should make this kind of work the focus of scholarly inquiry. It is work. And by understanding care labor as labor, we can assess the many forms of labor and laborers that shape our world. So by focusing on care labor, we can make this form of unpaid labor visible, and thus we give it a value. So what do I mean by care labor? It is a synonym for some very clunky, jargony words like social reproduction or social reproductive labor. There's a sociologist named Evelyn Glenn who defines social reproduction as, quote, the array of activities and relationships involved in maintaining people, both on a daily basis and intergenerationally, okay? So maintaining people, both on a daily basis and intergenerationally. So I imagine every single person in this room has done that kind of work, right? These activities include raising and socializing children, caring for the elderly, the disabled, caring for oneself, preparing food, cleaning the house, buying food, buying cleaning products to create a healthy home, and of course, maintaining relationships with your family or kin. The majority of this labor has historically fallen to women, and there's a reason for this. One of the main reasons that this labor has historically fallen to women is because women were excluded from jobs where they could earn a paid wage. So if we think back, over 100 years ago, there's the Industrial Revolution, right? And the Industrial Revolution really restructured life in the United States. And in central Appalachia, so southwestern Virginia, West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, and East Tennessee, that industry that came in was the coal industry. And since the colonial era, people knew about the existence of coal beds in the region, but it was really the growth of railroads in the 19th century. And with the growth of railroads came this new dependency on a whole lot of fuel. That's what brought large-scale industry to central Appalachia. So with that industry comes a literal restructuring of life. Family farms and homesteads gave way to these company-owned towns. And these towns often included, a company store, a church, a school, and then small tract houses for employees. And this move from the farm to the company town really changed how families approached labor. When families relied on the farm for food and goods to sell, everybody in the family worked, including small children. So women would often work alongside men in the fields, and then they would turn the raw good they produced and turn it into a meal or an item of clothes to wear or to sell. And because these farms were mainly self-sufficient, Appalachian families did not rely on a wage to live off of. And so, of course, that changes with the introduction of large-scale industry, right? So they moved from a farm to coal towns where families had housing as long as a man worked for the company. Residents in coal towns used company-provided scrip in a company-run store. So instead of working alongside men, as they did on the farms, there were very few opportunities for women to do wage work in these towns. And so instead, they worked in the home. They provided care that sustained life in these towns. They cultivated small gardens to provide a food source outside of what the company store provided. They prepared food for their children, for their families. They raised kids. They really focused on cleaning. If you look in the archives, there's a whole lot about cleaning. Saw these women asking each other, like, how do you get coal dust out of the house? Because think of how hazardous some of that material was that people were breathing in. And so this is really important work, and it's the work that sustained life under industrial capitalism, and it's care labor. In southern Appalachia, where we are right now, western North Carolina, North Georgia, where coal is less prevalent, logging was a pretty major industry. And so beginning around 1880, these large timber companies came in and bought up tens of thousands of acres at rock bottom prices. And so much like what was happening in central Appalachia, families were moving off of homesteads that were bought by mostly northern industrialists who created these timber companies, and they move into company towns, right? And so logging's kind of interesting because men would be up where the cutting was, and then families would be on the base of the mountain, and it's really where women were taking care of kids. So you can see that, again, women's unpaid labor is the thing that kept life running at a time when industry really reorganized large parts of this region. During industrial capitalism, when coal and timber were king, it really was women's care labor that sustained life. And of course, we know that those industries did not last forever. In fact, they began to decline by the 1920s. So timber was a very limited resource, and large-scale logging, which used heavy machinery and large tract clear cutting, depleted the land. As we know, when large trees fall, something does not magically just shoot up, right? And so these local economies that were once really self-sufficient, they found themselves in decline. And the number of lumber mills in North Georgia dropped drastically between 1909 and 1919. So within a 10-year span, it was, boom to bust. And, by 1924, Georgia state geologists declared that the stripped landscape had lost its potential as an economic resource. So unlike timber, coal had a longer boom-bust cycle, largely because of the two world wars. But life during that bust phase was really hard. And without employment in the coal industry, families would have to leave company towns. They moved back into extended families' farms that suffered from environmental effects of large-scale industry, including a diminished food source. So long before Black Tuesday and the Great Depression, these big events in the 1930s, Appalachian families endured significant economic hardship. And women, these caregivers under industrial capitalism, remained caregivers when industry waned. And many tried to earn a wage by taking in boarders and selling small housewares, all the while cooking, cleaning, raising kids. And as the 20th century progressed and new mechanical and fuel sources like natural gas were introduced, the coal industry, of course, began employing fewer and fewer people. So by the 1950s, a single wage was not enough for a family to live off of. So women began entering the workforce. And many found work in careers defined by an ethic of care, including careers in education, careers in nursing, and careers in childcare. And they continued to provide unpaid care labor in the home while they provided paid care labor to patients and students and children. And really supported by Cold War era legislation that aimed to create stronger public schools and health programs, women's care labor transitioned from the home to these new workplaces. So by the mid-20th century, women in Appalachia were providing various forms of care labor, family members in the home, and as citizen caregivers in doctors' offices and hospitals, schools, and child care centers. And this transition, it happened at a really interesting time in Appalachian history. We are in southern Appalachia right now, and I'm wondering, when I say Appalachia, what comes to your minds? Mountains, yep. Absolutely. Mountain regions. Homemade jam, yes. And it's like, and jelly. I really love some apple butter. Weaving. Yeah, so like self-sufficiency and kind of living off the land and these things that I think most of us in this room who are from Appalachia hold with a lot of pride. But in the mid-20th century, there was also another narrative of Appalachia. And maybe if we were not together in Cartersville, Georgia, we'd hear more of that other narrative. Think about the 1950s and 1960s. Little Abner, really popular. The Beverly Hillbillies, really popular. There were all of these kind of national narratives about poverty in Appalachia. And why is this American region, quote, so depressed? These mid-century cultural depictions created this image of Appalachia as an impoverished, backwoods place stuck in the far, far, far away past. And some of these associations linger today, right? Of course, we know, as people from this place, that Appalachia is diverse and it's complicated. And it's a region with really big cities, really rural towns, right? It's filled with world-class universities, great restaurants, beautiful trails, beautiful vistas. But historically, Appalachia has always occupied a really unique place in the nation's imaginary. And this really begins I do not.
Okay, well, it was about rural Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a book published back in the, what was it, maybe the 50s. Y'all don't know what I'm talking about, son.
I know the book, I can't tell you when, but yeah, that's a.
Yeah.
Really, it was a bestseller,
Yeah.
and it really, people of the North
Mm-hmm.
read the book, and it said that the people of the South were real rural.
Yep.
They all lived in trailers, so to speak,
Yep.
or shotgun after.
Yep.
All the women were pregnant and had kids,
Mm-hmm.
and they were all barefoot.
Barefoot. Yep.
That's reading the book, and it became a bestseller.
Yeah.
The people up north reading that thought of the South.
Yeah.
If you ever think about it, look it up, God willing. And
Your wife just made a point, you might find it on Netflix or Prime, because it was a movie.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I just looked it up, it was turned
God,
into.
The movie was 1930, or the book was 1933.
1933.
that really,
So a little Great Depression era.
really kicked in South being.
Yeah. Real rural.
Surviving it early.
Well, and there's that kind of narrative is just so popular. And, you know, if you really dig into this history, if you're interested in, you know, the history of depictions of Appalachia, follow me here, it really goes all the way back to the 19th century, right? Because remember those railroads that brought in coal, that brought in timber, these big industries, those railroads also brought in anthropologists and these people who were settlement workers. And, you know, this is during a period in the United States, it's called the Progressive Era. So there was a lot of concern about social welfare. There was a lot of concern about poverty. And so all of these people, I think we could call them social workers now. That degree was not quite hammered out. But all of these anthropologists, sociologists, came to Appalachia, looked around, and said, now, wait a second, we could fix this. And so they, in turn, shared what they saw with a national audience. And then that's really where some of these depictions of Appalachia's poor, backwoods, etc., comes from in the 19th century. And then that narrative gets regurgitated pretty much like clockwork every decade. Like every decade, a new book comes out. Every decade, a new news article comes out. And it's really interesting in that all of it really focuses on this idea that Appalachia is distinctive and an other and different than the United States, right? So a lot of this is happening because of industry, right? Coming in, railroads coming in, a whole lot of people are coming in who are confused. But also in 1890, this thing happens in the United States where the frontier closed. So that was in 1890, and there was this idea that, like, there's no more expansive land just for the grab, right? Like, America's filled out. And so in 1890, Appalachia became, quote, a creature of the urban imagination in 1890. So there's this woman named Mary Murphy. She really wrote this crazy popular book. It was called In the Tennessee Mountains. And she described the, quote, indefinable tinge of sadness that rests upon the Allegheny wilds, that hovers about the purply mountaintops, that broods over the silent woods, that sounds in the voice of the singing waters. So she's romanticizing a natural place while also discussing this, quote, settled melancholy of the population. And this is like a contradictory trope that gets played out over and over and over again. And certainly in the 1930s, the Great Depression, all of these images coming out, the New Deal comes to Appalachia, think about the Tennessee Valley Authority, think about hydroelectric power. Like, this is also when the media's really kicking off the ground, right? Journalists are coming out of city bureaus to rural places, recording it, blasting it out to the nation. And yes, in the 1950s and 60s, this continues. Jack Weller wrote a book called Yesterday's People about Eastern Kentucky in the 1960s. There's this real spate of literature just devoted to how different Appalachia is. And it's noteworthy in the 50s and 60s because what big event happened in the 1940s? World War II, right? And after World War II, there was all this prosperity. You know, America won a war. Think about all of the machines in motion. There was a lot of money in our economy. Things were looking good. It was like a time of significant prosperity. And so there was this disconnect, right? How could the rest of America be so prosperous? How could these suburbs be like cropping out of the earth? And then there's this one region that's not doing so well. And this was really concerning to government officials, federal government officials, because what major event comes after World War II? It's another war. Korea, and that's part of the Cold War, right? So the Cold War is the simmering conflict between the United States and the USSR. It's capitalism versus communism. And for the United States, Appalachian poverty was an embarrassment. And it was one that illustrated some of the cracks of capitalism. So US presidents were really concerned about what Russia was thinking about Appalachia, right? And it sounds kind of crazy, but put a pin in this. I can tell you my Russian West Virginia story later. But it's this kind of wild thing where Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson were really interested in Appalachian poverty, right? Is that Kennedy or Johnson? Very cool. Okay. Very cool. I mean, how can you talk about Appalachia in the mid-century and not acknowledge John F. Kennedy, who starts the Appalachian Regional Commission, right? And he also...
Sarah loves the Kennedys.
Well, I could have pulled some Kennedy quotes. I apologize. But of course, Kennedy, he's this big advocate for Appalachia, in large part because West Virginia pushed him over the edge to win the Democratic nomination. Big fan of West Virginia. He very famously said on West Virginia's centennial, God, the sun does not always shine in Appalachia, but, you know, there's promise. And it was, you know, not long before he was assassinated. So Kennedy, his eyes on Russia, thinking, what are they thinking about Appalachian poverty? And he sets out this really ambitious legislative platform, right? He's assassinated before he sees it through, but then a guy named Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and he takes that platform, and it's called the Great Society. And a big part of the Great Society is the war on poverty. And Lyndon Johnson kicks off that war on poverty on a front porch in Inez, Kentucky. And that's not a coincidence, right? He really wanted to focus on Appalachian poverty, kicks it off in Inez, Kentucky. And then there's this infusion of federal money to Central Appalachia to try and figure out how to solve a problem like Appalachian poverty. So along with that money, a whole lot of young people come to Appalachia. Has anyone heard of like the AmeriCorps Vista program, Volunteers in Service to America? That is one of the things that comes out of the Great Society. And even more journalists are now coming, right? Because they want to see, well, what in the world? The federal government's giving all this money. How's it playing out? And so, you know, after this decline of coal, after the decline of the timber industries, there's this increase in infrastructure, technology, consumerism, travel, and media. And Appalachia is really changing, right? And it's interesting, think about all of those tired tropes we know about Appalachia. We've heard it 1,001 times. So when the federal government starts pouring money into the region, everybody else in the nation's like, whoa, they're changing. And because for so long, Appalachia has existed as this romanticized place, one forever stuck in a distant past, people really emphasized the supposedly drastic nature of the change. The people who were living here were like, you've always lived in the 20th century, thanks for noticing. And, I want to be very clear, Appalachia is not a place stuck in the past, right? Like, that's a romanticized idea that I think needs to be quashed. And, there's something important to note that in the years immediately following World War II, think about all the rise in industry, mechanization. Coal industry is doing really well in the early 1940s. And so some of the newest movie theaters in the 40s are in Appalachia. There are these beautiful, opulent opera houses that pop up during the 1940s because coal was king. It was doing really well. So there was this moment of significant prosperity, and I don't want us to forget that as we discuss some of the more negative stereotypes of this place. So it's within this backdrop, right, of the decline of industry, the pervasiveness of poverty, and the war on poverty, that a group of students in North Georgia created Foxfire. Who has heard of Foxfire? Yeah, it's very cool. Who grew up with Foxfire? Okay, me. Who learned about Foxfire as an adult? I'm going to assume most of us. Yeah, I think the Foxfire books really, it's one of Georgia's greatest cultural gifts, right? Like Ray Charles, last year's Atlanta Braves team. Like, there are a few things cooler than the Foxfire project. So Foxfire began in 1966 when a struggling English teacher at Raven Gap Nacoochee School asked his students what would make class and school more interesting. And they decided to create a magazine, one that featured stories that they collected from their families about life in Southern Appalachia and some of the traditions here. And the students called it Foxfire after the glow-in-the-dark fungus that grew in the local hills. And so the first magazine was published in March of 1967. And it's created in Raven County, Georgia, by a group of Raven Gap Nacoochee students. And the Foxfire magazine circulated around the world. And the first magazine created this model that later ones followed. So it featured 3 sections. Section 1 was devoted to Raven County area because, quote, the region was filled with materials worth preserving. Section 2 highlighted authors and poets who were published nationally already. And section 3 included the work of new writers, mostly students. And in the editorial note of that first issue, they wrote, quote, we wanted material from the region, from schools outside this region, so we got it. So the first issue is really kind of all over the place, and it's exciting, kind of the diversity of thought that went into that very first Foxfire magazine. And so over the years, that second section of already published authors went away in favor of really focusing on their traditions and cultural heritage from Southern Appalachia. Marguerite Steedman, who was a resident of Raven County, she encouraged the project's advisor to look at where they lived for inspiration. I'm going to give you a really long quote, so stay with me, but I think it's really beautiful. She said, quote, the beauty into which you are born is often the beauty you never see. Go dig the gemstone out of your own hill. Make your students curious, then proud of their homes, or they'll be homeless wherever they go. And remember that what's not news to you may be big news to someone else. The most popular authors have been most successful when writing about the things they know best, end quote. And so this project dedicated to discussing life in Southern Appalachia was born. And over the years, the magazine traveled far beyond Georgia's northeastern corner. It became a series of books and a movie, and it became a source of inspiration for community-based history projects around the world. And with money from the book In 1974, Foxfire purchased land that then became an immersive history museum, which you can visit in Mountain City today. So, what does Foxfire have to do with Appalachia in the middle of the 20th century or care labor? I argue that at a time of significant change, Foxfire used care labor to preserve a version of Appalachian history and culture. Remember that definition of care labor, right? It's the array of activities and relationships involved in maintaining people both on a daily basis and intergenerationally. And at a time when globalization opened up the world, the Foxfire Project sought to preserve community traditions and practices, and it shared those traditions with people far beyond North Georgia. And people around the country learned about Appalachian history and culture thanks to the work of a group of high school students. And I think the Foxfire Project really illustrates care labor in a couple of significant ways. First, the project relied on students to conduct interviews with older people in their community. And this is really the core of the success of Foxfire. Inquisitive young students asking their older neighbors about what life was like back in the day. And living in Georgia's northeastern Appalachian Mountains, the students decided to go out in their communities, interview people to preserve traditions at risk of fading away with the older generations. And these personal connections students formed with those older contacts lasted long after interviews were conducted. Several Foxfire contacts appeared many times in the first 2 decades of the magazine. And one of the most beloved was Aunt Erie. She was born in 1885 in Macon County, North Carolina. And Erie K enchanted students and readers alike. Her husband died in 1966, and she did not have children. So the Foxfire, Arie, A-R-I-E. Cabe, C-A-B-E, Carpenter. And she was really just so beloved. She was so beloved that the students devoted a 10-page interview to her in the 1971 magazine. And they really became this support system for this older woman who lived by herself on a mountain in a log cabin not far from where she was born. And the students would regularly visit her. They brought her groceries, they'd fix up odd things around the house, and they kept her company. In a 1971 article titled "Popcorn and Leather Breeches," a Foxfire student wrote, quote, "Aunt Arie was not afraid to share any feelings with us. This made me feel really good that she still has the idea that people are all nice. She did not get at all suspicious if one of us ventured through the house. And on the way home, we expressed our feelings. We all thought she was real nice. Doing the work for nothing made us feel good inside because we knew that we were helping her out. At this visit, there was no generation gap whatsoever. Between ourselves, we agreed on everything." So for an older woman living alone, young people coming out to spend time with her, who tended to her house, who purchased her groceries, that was an act of care. It was an act of care labor. And Aunt Arie, in turn, she cared for those students. For the ones who did not go home during the holidays, she cooked them a big supper up at her house. And she also shared her history and her know-how of hog scalding, wood stove cooking, garden tending, and she passed all that along to those students, which is important because those skills are becoming more and more obsolete in an increasingly high-tech world. And really, sharing these skills allowed students to preserve a region's history, preserve it for future generations. And students first met Aunt Arie in 1970, and they visited her frequently until her death in 78. And over the course of the 70s, of course, things were changing pretty quickly in southern Appalachia. The world was opening up, the few family homesteads that survived were no longer the only viable option for self-sufficiency. And Foxfire students examined this tension in their 1975 magazine on the Betty's Creek community in Raven County. And they featured stories of people like Margaret Norton, who lived her entire life in Betty's Creek, which was the small, narrow, winding valley on the Georgia-North Carolina border. Students wrote that, quote, "The study of the Betty's Creek community from these earliest times to the present is a warm and fascinating look at the ways in which a small, isolated, close-knit community evolved, and through sheer, hardy self-sufficiency existed ably and happily without luxury. It is also a cold, sobering look at what pressing change and terrific increases in the pace of life can wreak on such a community. It is a look at how land, once essential for a family's existence, suddenly became a commodity with a price tag, and the new confusing issue of land development moved in." So students understood the importance of documenting all of the changes happening in their community. They could not halt the land grab, but they could interview people who spent their whole lives in Betty's Creek to create an archive to a place at risk of disappearing. And this active preservation of recording histories, of creating an archive, it's an act of care. It's an act of community level care. And when we understand the project of history as a project of care, we include stories of everyday people and places. It's no longer about a small elite group of influential people, but rather about the many individuals who comprise a community. So Foxfire project began in 1966, during that period when Appalachia was in the national news for its poverty, Beverly Hillbillies. One reporter for the Washington Post ran a story in 1963, and it's titled, quote, "A long trail of misery winds the proud hills." And he compared the poverty in Appalachia to that of newly decolonized African nations. And scholars of Appalachia constantly note that the region serves as America's other, something to judge the rest of the nation against. And Foxfire students quietly challenged that notion. In the century of negative stereotypes about the region, they wrote articles about how to build a banjo, how to cook on a wood stove, and how to build a cabin out of logs, right? They gained this information from all of the people they interviewed who held that knowledge. Foxfire celebrated Appalachian history and culture at a time when the region was the object of much debate regarding larger systemic issues like poverty. Students care, and asking about the past and various traditions, and the contacts care, and dutifully sharing their knowledge, preserved a history and a culture at a time of serious change. Several years ago, I spent a whole summer working at Foxfire, and one of the projects I worked on was updating the Foxfire book of Appalachian cookery. As someone who studies women's labor, I use sources like recipes as a way to understand the many forms of women's work. Because care work is so second nature, people rarely discuss it in archives. No one says, I cooked supper today. So recipes provide a kind of subtle documentation of this labor. And while in the archives, I listened to hours of interviews between students and contacts. After that, I feel like I know quite a few of the contacts, including Aunt Ari and Margaret Norton. And from them, I learned the ins and outs of how do you cook on a wood stove, how to best fry frog legs. And I learned like a dozen ways to make cornbread. Aunt Ari's is the best recipe out of that book. It works every time. And from them, I learned about corn shuckings and candy pulls and how that's how couples got all coupled up. And I came to know these women and their personalities while learning about Appalachian foodways traditions. And so really having the time to sit with their stories offered a valuable lesson to me, one that told me archives offer more than just facts or evidence to prove your argument. They also offer stories about people and personalities who walked and lived and cooked, just like you or me. These archives really illuminated the everyday and the everyday care labors that sustained families and communities. So, Foxfire began with that kind of group of students in 1966 who collected stories from their neighbors and family members to learn about the past. And they took real care to nourish their relationship with contacts. And their work was about more than simply creating a magazine. Many years after Aunt Erie died, students continued to remember her in subsequent magazines, and they always wrote about how they felt in her presence. They went back to those earlier interviews to see and learn from her, and she continued to share her story. All those interviews get recirculated every year, and those skills she shared in the 70s, people are still learning today, thanks to the time she took to share them. And it's really that care that preserved her story, one that we can return to again and again. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
When you were going over what students did, they had to realize that the outside world is changing.
Yeah.
But Foxfire students gave value to all of those experiences that we all had as growing up in Appalachia. So it was second nature to us, not to be put down by the outside world.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. That's very important. And I think it's one where that kind of like insider-outsider camp thing, we got to be careful of. But it's so fascinating. You talk to people who grew up in Appalachia, who grew up with Foxfire, it's like, yeah, that's it. It's not noteworthy. It's like, this is who we are. No big deal. Exactly. Which I think speaks to how special that project can be, right? To illuminate the everyday, to preserve the everyday. Yes, ma'am.
You had talked about how every decade, somehow or another, it comes back to Appalachia being another place.
Yeah.
I believe it was definitely within the last 10 years, maybe the last 5. Do you remember when a group of dentists, and I think it was from Middle Appalachia, went to Mountain View and said,
Oh, yeah.
because all of these people in Appalachia get Mountain Dew and are losing their teeth by the time they're 20, 30 years old, and they got underwritten by Mountain Dew to bring dental care,
Wow.
even in vans, into some of Middle Appalachia. So there, again, is that resurgence of Middle Appalachia as other than we are.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, once you're like tuned into it, your antennas go up because it happens all the time. And, you know, sometimes I guess it works in people's favor, you know, increased medical care. And I'm from Virginia, and rural area medical is really important because there are no hospitals within like a 100-mile radius in far southwestern Virginia. But, you know, we see it, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post, there's always like some, around an election, some story about a diner in southwestern Virginia or southern West Virginia. And I think we could place that within this longer trajectory of Mary Murphy's and, you know, discussing the sad and undeniable tinge of the forlorn mountain. Yes?
It was just so interesting that you brought up Mountain Dew, because we were talking about that. Yesterday we were talking about Mountain Dew and the origins of it, and how it was marketed specifically to people in Appalachia as a mixers for moonshine.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but she's from Germany. So like, we were talking about her love of Mountain Dew. While she was here in the United States, she's like, it just hits different. Like, you can't get this back home. We were talking about like the marketing of Mountain Dew and how it's specifically marketed to a kind of people, and like the branding of the original like Mountain Dew is like a quote unquote hillbilly, like sitting
Yeah.
like, drinking
With a
out of
jug,
moonshine,
yeah.
like a bottle jug. And so the fact that you brought that up was just so crazy because that's what I was thinking of like the whole time. I was like, it's like Mountain Dew marketing. And I always think that's so interesting, like as a marketing manager, the kind of products that are marketed specifically to people in this region and the kind of things that they think we're interested in because of this history of like poverty and disenfranchisement that they think that we have. They're like, this is the kind of stuff that they're going to like, or that they're going to be into because of that. I'm like, what? Like, there's a disconnect here.
I would love for you to do a project that looks at like Mountain Dew sales and, you know, Appalachia versus the rest of the country, and, you know, where is it marketed more heavily versus.
Well, and people really do believe that like we all drink Mountain Dew.
Yeah.
That's kind of the thing, and like they market it heavily at places like NASCAR races and things like that, because that's like their target market, and they think that we're all into that kind of stuff. That was like a case study that we learned about in like PR classes and marketing classes.
Very cool.
What is the comparison of the work of like the Concept Campus food and Foxfire? And also the comparison between like, so this is not a coal town or a timber town here, but it had a mill town within it. I don't know if you know that or not, but it's through, it was Goodyear that it was started as a, and it was the same type of situation, they had their own company stores and everything like that. And the, either snail industry, carpet industry, the comparison of that, because it's unparalleled basically up the spine of Appalachia, at least in Georgia it is.
Yeah.
And then the overall, how people can compare, when they talk about Appalachia, some even come to the point of the Ozarks being Appalachia, being a comparison of a comparable type of area as far as where people live in the mountains and stuff.
Yeah. So I guess raise your hand. Do you think the Ozarks are Appalachia?
No.
Yeah. Anyone else? Like, okay.
No,
Right.
you're not in the region, but you know, a lot of people, because it's the same type of stereotype.
Yeah.
The hillbilly from the mountain, and then they stereotype them coming from the same areas.
Yeah. And I think if we zoom out enough, we could probably.
Because one example is Little Avenue, which is the Ozarks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, and I think it's this kind of really, in a lot of ways, a stereotype of rural spaces, right? But then the nuance of the difference between the Ozarks and Appalachia is totally lost in a cartoon character, right? And so I think the question then is, why is it that Appalachia is constantly getting the stereotype sticker put on it? And I think a lot of it was, think about the development of Appalachia in the 19th century. So like coal companies were the first then, right? And textile comes a little bit later, and timber, a little bit after that. But, by 1900, the state of Virginia is giving a whole lot of money to coal companies to come in. In like 1870, the state of West Virginia has essentially ceded the state to corporations. The corporations had as much control as elected officials in West Virginia. And so I just think that early kind of 100% all in rush for resources put Appalachia kind of on the map fast. A little more eastern, you're not far from Washington, D.C., right? All these railroads are coming in. You can take a train from Princeton, West Virginia, all the way up to New York City to this day. That train line's been around since the 19th century. And so I just think it was almost easier for people to come in and out than, say, the Ozarks. I think the Ozarks developed a little later, a little slower. Exactly. And so,
I was thinking about the carpet industry,
yeah.
talking about the women taking care, they basically started that.
Yeah.
The shipbuilding industry itself. Then they were able to get into the textile, they might have been passed over wages wise.
Yeah.
They were in the industry. And I just think my grandparents had to work for years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They lived in the mill village, paid so much in
Mm-hmm.
and I even can remember not the store, but the store was there, but it was closed, but post office was still open. School was still there, but it wasn't used. Had their own swimming pool and beauty shop.
Yeah.
It was still open.
Yeah. Yeah, and baseball teams. That was a big
Yeah,
one.
they industrial baseball.
That's awesome. That's really interesting.
All of the stuff that you talk about, and you've done an excellent job. I love this.
Why, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate
I
it.
love your presentation.
Thank you.
I think we can set in with this.
Yeah, it's my witching hour in about 10 minutes. You're going to want me out. But thank you.
That happened, and mostly all of us grew up in some of it.
Yeah.
I grew up, my dad worked in the mill. He was a linen, that's what they called it.
Yeah.
Anybody worked in the mill was called a linen.
Yeah.
And my mother and a lot of my neighbors worked in the King Mill facility. And so we lived in Batesville, Mill Village. It was not that we had to pay a bill for our house. That time it was over with. But the village was still there.
Yeah.
But you know, we had some people had a very hard time. And it was not an easy life to live in Appalachia or in the rural South. But it was great times too. We had bad times, but we had great times.
Yeah.
And I think all of us that have a little age can say we are losing a lot. I think it's what we're seeing going on in the South today.
Yeah.
Because of industry moving in, because of people from all over the United States moving in, the South is not what it used to be. And I'm not talking about poverty, I'm talking about people, loving people, people that, we didn't even have a lock on our front door. We didn't have no air conditioning, all the windows were up, all of our neighbors,
Yeah.
but we were all in the same boat. And all of us kids played, and each one of us had 10 mothers. Because we'd get in a fight, one of the mothers would come out, and my name's Ed, and she said, Ed, you do that again, we'll wear your butt out.
Yeah.
And then we'll call you mom.
Yeah.
And we knew that was for real. And so I think when kids today didn't grow up when we grew up, and I feel like they've lost a lot because of how we have developed in the South. And I think in years to come, if the war stands, I think in years to come, the South will out perform the North anymore. This is the new North, is what you see right now. Everybody's moving out. And anywhere up north, Detroit, Michigan, all of it.
Yeah.
We did that. All of that's dead.
Yeah.
But we're seeing the South rise to the point that Florida, Georgia, Carolinas, North Carolina, all of that.
Yeah.
It's becoming the new powerhouse of the United States.
Yeah, definitely. Industry's booming here. Yeah, yeah.
All kinds of industries.
It sounds like you could probably give an oral history to the History Society. maybe y'all could start a Foxfire-esque project.
They'll have Foxfire too.
Yeah, there we are. Yeah, Foxfire June. Yes.
So, we actually did a video about the Foxfire book where we were making apple butter.
Yeah.
And Julie somehow volunteered to do that. And I noticed while reading the book, I had a similar experience to asking my great aunt to teach me how to make biscuits.
Yeah.
And, they give you exactly what you need, but there's not really measurements every now and there's a lot of until it looks right.
Yeah. Yes.
They know what a pinch is.
Uh-huh.
They just
And,
throw it
it would always, so
What's a peach?
well, like my great aunt is like my height. And so a handful to her might be a handful to me, but my mom was like 5'9".
Yeah.
So is that half a handful? Like, what
Yeah, till it looks right.
I've done it before. What does till it looks right mean?
Yeah.
And so growing up, you don't think about it because it is our history.
Right.
But that was them passing it on, and that was the way they were passing it on. And I'm sure it must have been frustrating if it wasn't what you knew, but it feels like maybe it was a society where it's like you don't know. Because they weren't, it didn't feel like, oh, this is something that I have to teach. It was like, well, you should know this. You see me do it every morning.
Yeah, that one. Yeah.
So did they ever feel like a little bit discouraged? Did they ever mention like, oh, why didn't they give me measurements or anything when they were writing?
That's a really good question, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot because, I'll ask my mom, who's from West Virginia, like, Mom, what's your cornbread recipe? And it's like a pinch of this, dash of that, don't mix it too hard, put it in the pan, call it a day. See you in 15. And that's not helpful to me because I'm very, I'm a very analytical kind of gal. Give me, exact measurements down to a quarter of a cup minus 2 tablespoons. Like I'm that kind of person.
I think that's one reason they started having the cookbooks in the churches. Because
Yes.
everybody kept saying, well, how do you do this and how do you do that? About the time you explain it about 5 or 6 times, nobody knows what you
Exactly. But even you look at those community cookbooks, and I love them. And you have people like my mom writing, and it's like pinch of this, dash that, just don't stir too hard, call it a day. And then someone like me who is, very meticulous. Your question, was it ever discouraging or frustrating for people? The answer is yes. And what's kind of fun, and in my work at Foxfire, there's still Foxfire fellows who are high school students from Rabun County. And so like one of the things we had to do was make a recipe out of the Foxfire cookbook on a wood stove. And it was a very cool experience because you have to realize, like, what does it mean to cook by feel? And like, we all cook, like we have all operated ovens before, like, we're adults, we have to keep ourselves alive. But with high school students who are not used to cooking, asking them to like follow a 70-year-old recipe that's essentially like, put on a blindfold and do it by feel was bananas. And they had a really hard time, but then they all came around to realize if you make cornbread every single day, which is what Ari Carpenter did, you don't need to measure it, right? Like, exactly, you just do it. And, some people make biscuits every single day, and they're beautiful and they turn out great. My biscuits do not. But
My grandmother, I asked her about her
Yes.
biscuits, and she's like, I don't know, just do it till it looks right.
Yes.
That's not helpful.
not at all helpful. But maybe if the Foxfire thing teaches us anything, do it until it looks right, and it might turn out, right? Like if your grandmother has this recipe and it served her well for decades, odds are it'll serve you well too. You just got to practice it.
Man, she used to get up every morning about 5 o'clock, go in the kitchen, get out and mow, get lard.
Yep.
Get a handful of lard, throw it in there with flour. So I mean,
Yep.
dash that, made biscuits, put them in a wood stove,
Yeah.
cut, baked it.
And nothing better.
Smoked biscuits.
A little smoke.
Anybody else hungry?
You gotta make that roast that you talking about, the roast that you learned how to make, you said you had a recipe for.
A cornbread. Man, like a dozen cornbread recipes. And I'm really analytical, so I was trying to measure them. That I can do.
Thank you, Amelia.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.